In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, the Fire Store has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today.
Fire Facilities manufactures steel live fire training towers, customized to meet your training needs. Check us out at FDIC or learn more at firefacilities.com.
Taking it to the streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to the newest edition of the Buildings on Fire's podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Naum. On your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world. The Buildings on Fire podcast is a monthly radio talk show program here on fireengineering.com blog talk radio. Some of you may notice that we're using a little bit of a different tagline here on our program. The Buildings on Fire Taking It to the Streets podcast has evolved to just a succinct Buildings on Fire podcast with Christopher Naum. It's going to be our new tagline going forward here, just to simplify some of the aspects of our program and also to take a look at some of a broader scale perspective on some things that we've got planned for all of you as we proceed into the new year here. It's interesting to note that our program, certainly as it existed for many years, actually over 15, 16 years here, we first started off as a pioneering podcast program all the way back in 2009. And in 2010, we were invited to be part of an evolving new podcast program that at that time was very new to certainly to the industry and to the profession. And I was certainly very proud to be a part of that. In the early days, the platform that we were originally on was Firefighter Netcast, and that was produced and conceived and produced and run by Lieutenant John Mitchell, who came out of the Chicagoland area. And I certainly want to extend my thanks to John for that opportunity all the way back in 2010 when our program, Taking It to the Streets, actually went live on a national and international basis here. And we were able to bring this program forward diligently over the last 15 years, all the way, again, from 2010 here to 2025. So I certainly want to acknowledge John for that extraordinary insight back in the day as one of the pioneers, certainly in the fire service realm, of conceiving, developing, and helping to produce a number of exceptional programs. Another great program here on Fire Engineering that many of you may listen to is my good colleague, Chief Doug Klein, who does fire and training. And many times you'll hear us cross-pollinating and doing some programming. We actually have a current program that we are developing on both sides, both here at Buildings on Fire and then also on Chief Klein's fire and training blog and webcast site. But one of the things that we're doing on Chief Klein's program as we started off a series similar to what we're doing here on Buildings on Fire, dealing with some size up perspectives. And again, if you cross over on the platform, go over to his program, you'll hear some different insights regarding some of our perspectives on size up, and especially as it relates to some of the acronyms that are out there. And that's a current multi-part series that's currently in place and in play, and that you can listen to both in the archives as well as also listen to live as we currently are producing. But again, Buildings on Fire going forward will be known as Buildings on Fire, the Buildings on Fire podcast with Chris Naum. And I'll be still retaining my presence here on a great platform here at Fire Engineering, and certainly the good family that have been exceptional to us over the last number of years. I would encourage you to, again, are either continuing, ever expanding following of dedicated listeners, as well as our newest listeners that may be listening in for the first time or of recent. Again, a lot of exceptional archived programs that if you go back into the vaults within the archives of fireengineering.com here in the podcast segments, both in terms of our program, Doug Klein's programs on fire and training, Chief Danny Sheridan's that we've had the opportunity to co-produce and to present a number of programs on his site, as well as many others. Again, our brothers and sisters who are producing and developing and publishing these phenomenal podcasts and now webcasts that are being presented in both a visual as well as the audible standpoint. There's some exceptional programming to over a lot of years going back to take a look at and listen in on some exceptional insights, programming, and so forth. So our program here on this episode of Buildings on Fire is continuing our series that we began in the beginning of this year, talking about size up. And one of the things that our first program delved into was, again, the predictability performance, and we focused in on size up literacy in our part one program, specifically discussing and then eventually revolving around conversations on compromise and collapse. So how do I take and look at the specifics of size up, develop this degree of literacy that I believe we established very well in the latter part of 2024. We had a multiple part series discussing reading the buildings, getting into this concept of predictability. And again, that led into a number of different attributes dealing with size up. And before I get too far ahead, I'm going to, again, talk a little bit about some of the size ups as it relates to specifics. But our theme of this particular episode is focusing in on, for better words, inside and out. Both the inside and the outside or exterior size up. We have traditionally focused in on the attributes and the insights derived from conducting exterior size up to our buildings, and that evolved into conducting the 360 around a particular structure or series of structures, but specifically looking at the building from the perspective of fireground insights that would help influence our decision-making or guide or sometimes immediately direct our decision-making process. And more often than not, that focused in upon some of the issues affecting the building regarding the actual or projected presence and the degree and the severity of fire conditions, or again, in a more global standpoint, we're talking about the emergency fireground scene, identifying the severity, urgency, and growth. What are the particulars of the incident in terms of the arrival? Are they matching up with the dispatch information? What does that building intel provide us once we've arrived on that fireground? And as I've mentioned, there are 4 reads when we talk about evaluating and assessing emergency scenes, or specifically when we talk about the structural fire scene, and that is reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, and then reading the company. And the company component continues to be an evolving area, for better words, because it is gaining much more traction of recent. And I say that within the last couple of years in particular, we're seeing a greater degree of insights from a variety of different individuals who, for whatever reasons, have started identifying and capturing as well as internalizing how human performance has such a significant role on what we do on the fireground. And I have been very fortunate to have been involved in human performance related aspects within both the operational and the emergency scene settings, but more globally, just talking about and being able to integrate and implement human performance concepts that are derived from a number of different areas and disciplines and so forth, and capture those and apply them toward the fireground. And it's important to note that I think when we talk about both operational and leadership related traits, and more importantly, when we talk about them in the context of fireground operations, the human performance component as it relates to the company continues to be an uncharted area, but one that has the most significant potential impact when we talk about decision-making, options, adaptiveness, and some of the other factors that come into play. We seldom take into account the variables that may be present, or the consistencies that may be present, or the variables. But again, more often than not, it's the variables that may challenge what we perceive to be as the consistencies as they relate to human performance at the company level, on that tactical box, when we talk about emergency scene operations, on the fireground, and how that plays out into the decision-making process. It's such a critical element and domain, functional area, and those variables that need to be identified, processed, and then determined how they will play out in terms of what we may or may not be doing. So we'll leave that for another level of discussion and so forth. But it's safe to say that, again, fireground, building, compartment, and company, those four integrated areas, those four reads, those four operational considerations continue to thread into our modeling when we talk about the building facts model and everything that we've been discussing over many, many years on the predictability of building performance and such. So if you go back to our previous program on part one, again, we focused in and honed in on some of the attributes and the literacy items, the things that one needs to be aware of and be able to implement in a very timely and really seamless manner on the fireground as they relate to compromise and collapse. Certainly one of the most critical elements when we discuss and identify size up, dealing with a structure and an occupancy, is to identify the resiliency integrity of that building to allow us to conduct operations, whether it be within, around, on top, underneath, inside that particular structure, and then having an appreciation for that building's resiliency and integrity as it relates to the operational time. And that normally is related back to delta time, the delta time or the elapse of time, or as we've defined it, the tactical windows that one might have available to them for the conduct of operations within the critical early few minutes or the expanded operational time on the fireground. So identifying the building's potential integrity upon arrival, identifying the conditions that may be affecting that building's ongoing degree of integrity and resiliency and resistance that may lead to a isolated compromise or a catastrophic structural collapse. And it's everything in between. And again, we got into that level of discussion. We actually did a program nationally at the Fire Department Safety Officers Conference here just recently this past year, which actually dovetailed in with our program during the month of January, in which we rolled out the first part of this particular series. And at the Fire Department Safety Officers annual conference setting, we actually did and presented a predictability building performance training module that looked at compromise and collapse. And again, looking at reading those issues and specifics dealing with size up, which again was part of our cursory insight review in our part one program. So in this particular part, we're going to discuss some further insights regarding one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most neglected areas that when we do talk about size up, and that is interior size up or inside size up, and thus the title of our class, inside and outside. So we have done pretty well overall within the fire service. We're continuing to see evolutions. We're seeing some increasing. We're either moving forward in a number of steps, or we sometimes are moving backwards in terms of progress. And unfortunately, I see much more moving backwards at times versus moving forwards, just because there's a different set of considerations, a different insight, or something that might even be the flavor of the day that comes out of nowhere in a recent writing or a series of online presentations that suddenly puts a spin on size up. But fundamentally, size up has remained relatively consistent since the 1950s, when size up and those considerations in the size up model was first introduced by Chief Lloyd Lehman. And in 1951, in his textbook on firefighting, and this is not the attack book, but the first blue book in 1951 on firefighting, he discussed some of the insights on sizing up a structure. And those fundamentally remained in place. Some slight changes that occurred from 1950s into the early 1960s with the publication of a couple of textbooks dealing with the fireground tactics. But it wasn't until the late 60s, early 1970s, and then Emanuel Fried's textbook on fireground operations came about, and that really focused in on some things that were being developed in the late 60s and culminated in the early 1970s. Williams Clark books in 1974, but Emanuel Fried's book on fireground operations gave us some of what we consistently have been utilizing regarding fireground size up. And then we fast forward to the 1990s when Chief John Norman gave us the Coal was Wealth acronym, and that has, for the most part, resonated throughout the United States, certainly over the last 30 plus years. And it's interesting to note, as again, I have the opportunity to teach and to interface with many organizations throughout the United States on an annual basis through our lecturing and seminar programs. Just interesting to note that there continues to be either nothing in terms of a formal size up process. There are a variety of things, and we've talked about this in a couple of our episodes in the last quarter of 2024. If you go back to some of our reads and some of the historical perspectives on size up, I think we did a program a couple of actually, I think it may have been a year or so ago, or revisited it a couple of times over the last couple of years, but talking about the history of size up and conversations about reading the fireground. And again, it's interesting to note, if you've never heard the stories on where size up originated, and actually I'll just reinforce or reiterate this, is that the concept of the formal concept of size up originated in the International Association of Fire Chiefs first edition of the Fire Chiefs Handbook in 1932. It was being developed in the late 1920s, over 100 years ago, and the concepts of size up as they were developed in that definitive book. Again, the first textbook for the American Fire Service was written and published in 1932. And within that textbook, there was a discussion of what size up was, who conducted it, and again, they discussed upon the first arriving officer weighs the heaviest burden. And as they discussed that, and those were the words that were utilized in the book, rests a significant burden and responsibilities. The first arriving officer should be evaluating the conditions and developing the incident action plan, of which they also discussed. They talked about developing the first plan of approach, talked about size up, and gave a number of different attributes that were identified at that time. And they also, again, just to reinforce it, they also talked about the best practice, because that was the reason that whole book was put together. Best practice was to identify what was being done in this evolving era of the fire service in the late 1920s and 1930s, as it was being challenged by the evolving nature of building construction, the low rises or tenements that were now turning into high-rise structures, and super talls of that day and era. So when we talk about high-rise construction, well, that was very unusual at that time. We started seeing the rise of cities and the rise of buildings in a much higher degree of height that started creating, as it does all the way to today, creating a significant series of challenges. You know, we talked about high-rise operations all the way through the 1970s and 80s, and here we are now in the mid or early stages of the 2000s, but certainly from the 2010 here to the 2025 era, we now are seeing the super talls and how they certainly are challenging many jurisdictions around the United States based upon those conditions. And even with that, we are also seeing the evolution of construction that now creates another set of parameters for sizing up and evaluating, and criteria that has yet to be further identified or even vetted when we talk about mass timber, CLT, ply scrapers and so forth. But the rise of the newest type of class 4 construction as it relates to the utilization of mass timber is also going to be creating a series of buildings that reach significant heights, that have different materials that are going to react differently under fireground conditions, that require some different perspectives on size up. So with that being said, let me just get into a couple of items here as we discuss some of the parameters of inside and out. So, and again, this is not going to be a very long program, but I wanted to plant some seeds for conversation and discussion before we move into our third part, which is actually going to, as it's currently planned, we hope to have a part 3 of our program presented live at FDIC, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And we're going to be doing our program live from the hallway in the fishbowl at FDIC in Indianapolis. So our part 3 program, we're going to have a couple of different guests coming on, and it'll be live from the floor of FDIC. That'll be part 3. Our part 4 program will culminate later in the month of April on April, let's see what date is that. It'll be published on April 24th, and that'll culminate, at least as we're currently seeing it, our 4th installment on our Size Up series, dealing again with Size Up literacy. So when we talk about developing Size Up literacy, we've done a fairly good job, as I mentioned, dealing with size up within the exterior. The 360, taking a look at some different parameters, focusing in on fire behavioral related conditions, fire severity, fire location, those things that we know, those things that we're trying to project or trying to predict. And then certainly the second area that has always been one of the primary objectives of performing size up, and that is to identify the location of entry points, and then also identify conditions in which we might have civilians in distress or in entrapment. So as we do our 360, we are looking at the building to identify potential avenues of fire extension, fire travel, those things that may not be evident on the street side. And as we conduct that 360 and looking at the different divisions around that structure, there should be a number of other things that we should be looking at. But normally we're trying to identify fire behavioral conditions, and then identify life safety issues, and then also at the same time identifying primary or alternate entry points or exit points to that structure, and then hopefully communicating that information accordingly via our radios, face-to-face. If we're conducting a company level size up, we should be very much aware that there are 2 very distinct types of size up: those size ups that are done initially by the first arriving officer, or typically the first arriving company, and then the command level size up that's normally conducted by the first arriving command officer. There's also the continuous or ongoing size up that may be conducted by a divisional officer, or maybe conducted by a chief's aide or a designee who's been given an assignment to conduct a more thorough size up as conditions and operations are being conducted within that typical 10-minute tactical window. And that again is to validate the assumptions or the presumptions or assumptions that are being made at the time of arrival, and if those conditions are changing based upon the continuation of performing a size up. So there's going to be information, and we typically, when we talk about interior size up, the best way to sort of frame that out has been the kind of information that's coming about from a CAN program, but it's much more than that. So typically when we're getting a CAN report from the interior, we're talking about progress, different related issues, but it's normally based upon the activity at hand. What are we achieving relative to fire suppression? Are we moving forward? Are we gaining ground in terms of the degree of fire involvement within a particular compartment? But what I want to indicate here is that we are not formally developing criteria for sizing up interior buildings for specific types of buildings. And I say this specifically because not all buildings require an interior size up. Due to the footprint, due to the occupancy type construction of many buildings, an interior size up is not necessarily required. However, in some circumstances that I'll at least point out here in this program, is that in some building types, it is imperative. It's operationally imperative that we identify some critical attributes and characteristics upon entering the interior of that structure from various position points and again, from various individual or company or team perspectives, and communicating that information to command. And the reason being is that what one may assume to be present on the outside of the structure may be entirely different upon entering into the compartment, entering into the interior confines of those rooms and the configurations of the interior that may not be evident, may be assumed, but may be proven to be inaccurate as soon as we pass the threshold of a doorway or make entry through an exterior position into the interior through any other type of openings. And again, primarily we're talking about the concept of vent enter within the interior of the structure. And again, the whole aspect of what one might be performing upon that entry. But it's important to note that many of our buildings, depending upon whether we talk about mega mansions or large area residentials as such, or large footprint commercial buildings, our entry point may not necessarily be through that front main doorway. And I think it's important for us to instill that concept on today's evolving fireground, because the adaptability of that concept and being able to implement that is critical in many, many buildings in terms of, again, what may be present, other challenges or impediments that may restrict our ability to make entry in that standpoint. And in some instances, making entry to the interior of a given building may be actually preferable to make entry through an alternate means of entry around that perimeter wall, depending upon, again, a variety of different factors. So we talk about reading the fireground. I think we got into that discussion previously, but there may be a more optimum entry point based upon fire location, hazards, other conditions, occupancy use, occupancy hazards, as well as other characteristic conditions within that building. So I want to at least give some insights on a couple of different examples here in which making entry within certain type buildings and providing some both visual, observable types of indicators, and then sometimes actually getting into a intrusive degree of examination. And by that meaning actually opening up a wall, opening up a ceiling, opening up a floor to identify some elements, or going into key compartments if you're able to access them based upon the degree of fire involvement, heat condition signatures, and so forth, or other mobility, tactical mobility issues within the building. But nonetheless, one of the first things that one needs to identify, I'll give you the example of a Main Street Type 3 building. One of the most critical elements with our Type 3 structures upon entering, especially going through a storefront on street side and making entry into the building, is to identify the ceiling height, identify what is the volume and the floor area. So it's not only the square footages, but identifying the volume, the height of that ceiling upon making entry. More often than not, the soft floors, the inherent design features of our Main Street buildings that typically had transom glass along the storefront areas, a much higher floor to ceiling area, certainly all the way up to the underside of the floor joists that in many instances, based upon the era and vintage, would have had or potentially may have had tin ceilings applied to them to provide some degree of fire resistiveness or fireproofing, as it was called back in that early era of the 1900s. But over the course of a building's life cycle, there are a number of critical periods when we talk about decades of time in which certain things affected these buildings that resulted, especially when we talk about concealed spaces, resulted in the lowering of that compartment's volume by virtue of the addition of additional ceilings. So if one is entering a Type 3 Main Street type structure, and it's either suspected or observed that transom glass is present above the storefront area, it's always should be assumed, because that is a very, very common feature that was present in all of those buildings in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But upon entering, if one ends up finding a ceiling that is common to the top header of a door, or that storefront, or slightly above the transom glass, but the critical element there is that below or above the transom glass clearly indicates that one can assume that I have at least as a minimum, the rule of thumb that we utilize and try to implement is a rule of thumb of at least 3 concealed spaces between that low-level ceiling that may be present, again, at head height of a door at the header, or may be present just above the transom that again would go to the underside of the floor joist that may be present on that first floor. So it's critical to identify those. And in many instances, again, we're seeing this kind of evolution. We saw the introduction of multiple ceilings over the longevity or the lifespan of our buildings, and then currently we have seen those being removed and actually going all the way back up to the original tin ceilings, or removing degraded tin ceilings that may be present in their original state, and then applying or exposing the structural wood floor joist based upon architectural treatments for the interior. So there are a number of both aesthetic and non-functional related conditions in which we may be bringing in material and changing the configuration and the layout of the interior. But it's critical to identify the volume and the square footages and identify ceiling conditions. I'll say this when we talk about interior size up on commercial buildings. It's important, especially because of architectural and design treatments that are common to commercial type buildings. And again, it varies based upon the footprint. It varies on a number of capacities. But whether I talk about a big box or whether we talk about a small commercial strip, it's very, very important to communicate, number one, identify, and then thus communicate the presence of a drop ceiling or suspended acoustic tile ceiling that may be present within the commercial building. We have two different types of conditions, and there's sometimes a variation, but the critical thing here for an interior size up is to identify the absence or presence of some type of a ceiling membrane system that is providing for and creating either a void or concealed space between the floor, the ceiling, and the underside of the roof structure, or a plenum space. And is that solid? Do we have sprinkler protection or heads that are located below that ceiling? But just the presence of a ceiling does two things. It identifies that I have a plenum or concealed area that is present, that is going to be of a further needed identified space in terms of what is the size of that volume, which is another degree of size up. But it also provides a degree of protection based upon the degree of fire involvement within the compartment, the integrity of that ceiling system to resist fire propagation, both heat and flame, into the concealed area, thus giving us more operational time to restrict the flow path of that heat condition within the areas of our exposed structural members. So that is part and parcel. Sometimes it's aesthetic, sometimes it's functional in terms of providing a fire resistive barrier or plane between the interior compartment and that concealed space. So if it's absent, that becomes a critical identifiable interior read, because I, as an incident commander, it's imperative to have that degree of building intel communicated, because now that is going to significantly and potentially impact operational tactile windows, flame, heat propagation and movement, the stratification within that ceiling space, and how that may lead to potential compromise and collapse within the ceiling, the underside of the ceiling, and structural components of the component, the assemblies and the systems of that roof deck. So it's very, very critical. I think if nothing else, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about ceiling presence again in our commercial buildings, and then the size of our volume of our residentials that we'll mention here. But within our Main Street buildings, the identification, the absence or presence of a ceiling, if it's low, it's very likely we're going to have multiple concealed spaces that are critical to be opened up in a coordinated fashion, because you very well may have unchecked fire travel and heat that may be affecting the structural integrity, or it may actually start impacting and burning through some of the exposed structural wood members, whether they be joist, beams, or column assemblies. The presence of cast iron, the presence of cast iron stirrups or other materials, the presence or absence of hybrid construction in those areas. So there's a number of different things. So let's just focus in on the absence or presence of multiple concealed ceilings or spaces. Do I have an exposed underside of either a roof or floor system in our type 3s? And that normally is identified upon initial entry past the threshold through the storefront into that building, because that will have some insights. Now also recognize that, again, different tenant spaces may have different conditions. So we may have open spaces on the interior. So as we're entering, we might have a narrow or deep as it's consistent with a type 3 constructed building, but is the integrity of the bearing walls or party walls still in place, but another degree of communications on that interior is to identify, do we have connectivity? Do we have any type of condition in the commercial and retail first floor spaces that opens up all of the associated exposures, whether they be on the Bravo or on the Delta side, to other communications along the entire line of storefronts that may be part of that particular building. So that is very, very important. And again, as it relates to the commercial building, absence or presence of the ceiling membrane system is going to give some insights that are going to, influence decision-making, influence the tactical window, and certainly should be of a consideration when we're talking about structural integrity of the roof deck in the absence or presence of any other type of roof accessories, such as smoke vents or heat vents or skylights or other types of features that may be present in those locations. Another item to note on our commercial building is to identify the location. Again, if they're observable, again, recognizing that in small footprint buildings, you may not have the ability to observe based upon smoke migration and smoke density, the location or the conditions of those ceilings, but also identifying the presence of any type of interior suspended rooftop units or HVAC systems that may be present. So both heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, many times the localized units may be suspended from key areas and then ducted from those locations in very specific geographical areas around that building. So anything that we are identifying, whether you are part of the interior truck search and rescue team or engine company team, again, you were looking up at the ceiling. What's suspended? Do we have types of signages? Sometimes we have significant signages. Do I have any other type of presence of the ceiling systems, interior suspended HVAC and air conditioning units or other devices that may be utilized? Again, those are important reads to identify visually, communicate that information back. But I think if nothing else, the absence or presence of a ceiling system becomes one of the most critical operational insights that the inside read in a commercial building may provide the commanding officer. And hopefully they're able to identify and comprehend what that means. But again, we've got to train, we've got to pull that stuff together. Some of the other things that one will look at when we're making entry in a commercial building, again, when we talk about interior reads, we should be very familiar with certain layouts and floor plans of some of our both small box and big box type of buildings. But again, identifying what may be present in specific commodity areas or the use of particular geographical areas within the interior confines of the compartment or the floor layout within the building. That should be communicated in terms of what we're observing upon that initial entry, because again, the conditions may rapidly change due to the openness of that space. And the same thing is going to be true when we talk about making entry into a large area residential or a new mega mansion or giga mansion or tetra mansion. The larger the interior space, the connectivity, large open continuous spaces, again, what we can observe, what we can identify in our residentials. Again, we are looking for, we typically may find upon entry a sizable entry foyer that may be multiple stories in height, leading to open stairwells, or it may be low upon entry from an architectural standpoint, and that may lead you in past the entry foyer or lobby area into the grand openness of a multi-story interior space. So again, identifying what may be, and again, identifying quantitatively what the size of that volume may be, trying to project, trying to identify based upon developing that skill set level, what the potential height may be, or just indicating, if nothing else, is that I have a large open space that likely may lead to a two-story or greater interior volume and space that may open up to second or upper floor mezzanines or upper floor balconies that may lead to other related program spaces on the interior of that structure. Other factors when we talk about the more invasive activity of interior size up, normally will revolve around, and again, it's going to be based upon the construction of the buildings and what is suspected or is actual for the interior space conditions, but opening up. And again, we should be considering and have a process and a technique in place and have practiced this particular aspect. But again, I would encourage our listeners to utilize interior size up processes. And one of those processes includes the ability to open up a wall, open up the ceiling, and open up a floor upon early entry before one starts moving too much further into the space. Now, recognizing that the utilization, the effective and accurate utilization of thermal imaging cameras has its limitations and also has its positive attributes. But nonetheless, one of the things that should never be taken away from is the ability at times, when appropriate, to open up a wall, open up a floor in that vestibule foyer area, and then, if available, open up that ceiling to identify potential construction features. So one of the things that we are looking for is, again, if I'm opening up that ceiling, I'm identifying what type of construction I might have, or does that lead to another observable condition in which another concealed space may be present. So as I'm opening up these interior condition, it is part of sizing up and providing evaluation. But the earlier we are able to do that, the more critical that building intel may be to the continuing fluid process of assessing the effectiveness of our incident action plan, assessing what is the progress that is being accomplished and being attained by interior companies performing a variety of duties, whether they be interior truck work, ventilation, support, search and rescue, or suppression activities. That building intel will be important to identify, are we able to say the extent of operating within that particular building, or if I'm identifying a particular component, system, or assembly, and again, heat signatures, flame impingement, and so forth, I may identify that I may have limitations on what and how long I may be able to stay in that place based upon going back to our size up conversations in our first episode, talking about compromise and collapse. It goes back to integrity, resiliency, integrity, and time. Does that compartment give us the ability to operate within it for a designated period of time? If so, what is the projected time frame in that tactical window? It should be nothing greater than 10 minutes. And again, based upon additional CAN reports, progress reports, benchmarking at around that 10-minute mark, we can, again, take all of that information coupled with performing additional 360s, 180s, or 90s, just, again, the visual indications, other indicators that are coming about through the continuous fluid process of continuous size up and evaluation. And it really goes beyond size up. So it's really more the continuous assessment of that building during the duration of operations in that 10-minute tactical window that leads to other critical building and operational intel, gets formulated, assessed by command, and determinations made on whether we stay the course or whether it's suggested or it's recognized immediately that there may necessarily require us to change a direction and a mode of operation. So when we talk about how that influences, sometimes it may be very immediate and it's very forthcoming, very obvious. Other times the assessment process is going to rely on experience, gut information that again, just experienced incident commanders have developed, that recognition, prime decision-making, naturalist decision-making. Do not disregard sometimes what your gut and what your head is telling you when something may not be entirely materializing, that your cognizant process is not consciously identifying, but just something is telling you something not quite right. And again, don't disregard those particular aspects. So the interior size up, there's a number of different attributes that fall within a variety of different buildings. So it's not one simple process, but it is when we talk about certain types of buildings in terms of what we're looking for. So typically we're looking for changes in what one might expect to find within the building. So when we're entering a building, all buildings of certain era and vintages within our designated era and vintage time frame that we have developed as part of our first arriving construction and tactics modeling. When we look at these era and vintages, certain buildings have consistencies in terms of their layout, what they lead into upon entering, whether it be a commercial or residential or type 3, type 4 related building, as well as our newer types of structures, whether they be from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the 80s and 90s, and the types of buildings that we are experiencing in terms of architectural design and layout. There are certain things one can expect based upon the occupancy type in terms of layout. So one of the biggest rules of thumb is if you're entering and you're not encountering what you normally would expect in terms of a layout or location of other certain types of spaces, it certainly may suggest if we've passed that threshold of a doorway or entry point and the interior completely has a different type of layout versus what the outside is suggesting or that building read suggests upon the first arriving. In other words, you may have a type 3 constructed building that has been gutted out. The interior is all hybrid new construction. The layout may have been reconfigured. There may be different types of structural supports. So it may look like a type 3 Main Street structure on the exterior upon arrival and size up. But again, upon entry, we have a different type of a layout. So the layout and the configuration, that is important note to pass along to command, because again, that anomaly, that change in building predictability performance may be a significant influencer on what might transpire further into the operation, even in terms of a go or no go. So the change in expected layout and configuration. If there's evidence of mixed construction or alterations and revisions, again, that's going to be an indicator that, again, it has to be further evaluated, but maybe an indicator that some changes to the incident action plan may be required. But again, we're looking at layout configurations, the change in materials, change in elevations, the presence or absence of mezzanines, or suddenly going into a first floor area and seeing that it's all opened up into the second floor or greater. So change in square footages, change in volumes of the compartments. So again, we talk about reading the building, reading the compartment. As we move through the building, and again, some other characteristics here that we'll get into in another program, or we can get some sidebar conversations going offline here. But we get into various compartments of the building. Again, we are looking for the presence of windows, doorways, square footages, volume type areas, the locations of ceilings, the presence of exposed ceiling or construction systems, the change in volumes in terms of square footages and cubic footages within the volume setting. So the change in the footprint, the change in the volume spaces as one goes from space to space. So there are those particular factors, but it's safe to say that, again, anytime we recognize or identify changes in materials, changes in elevational changes, the presence of different types of materials, or again, clearly definitive or suspected concerns regarding what the building looks like on the outside versus what we are encountering on the inside, are significant building intel reads that need to be communicated back to command. And this is inclusive of getting into an operational mode. So as we're working in a particular space, if we suddenly encounter something that's unexpected, that kind of information is very, very pertinent to command's decision-making process, evaluation of risk, and determination on actions in terms of the location and the operations that are being conducted within the interior of those building locations. So just a couple of tidbits regarding some of the interior sizing up. And again, I'll clearly make mention that there is no definitive listing. It really is building specific, oriented for age and vintage of both residential to commercial to other types of structures. More often than not, I'll just say this, when we're encountering potential interior conditions that are, especially in our older type structures, so older residentials, again, the same rule of thumb needs to be considered, and that is, if I enter that space and the space does not have the characteristics of what the building and the era and vintage in which it was designed are expected, that is an important item to note. And I'll just say this, and many times you'll enter a building that looks like a 2.5-story wood frame or a multiple floor building, of Victorian type of construction from the outside. And upon entry, again, we have either the entire interior or significant areas have been modified extensively to create a different type of layout. If you find the staircases changed in position, or the staircase present but large open type of planning, it certainly highly suggests, with a high degree of probability and reliability, that significant modifications and changes have occurred in that building that are far more than cosmetic, that may be structural, that will change the building's performance. And again, the predictability is not going to be that of a balloon frame structure built in, let's say, the 1920s or 30s or 40s, but may actually act as a hybrid type structure with both new and old construction that may be present within the building. And I think, so we're just getting into the final couple of minutes of our program. And again, we're just scratching the surface on some of our conversations. And hopefully we've given you some insights. So first and foremost, the concept of both conducting interior as well as exterior size up is something that has not been discussed nearly enough. Those conversations are not occurring in tactical classes, to the best of our knowledge, from what we've seen across the U.S. And one of the things that we have been diligently implementing in our tactical programs on building reads and operations is conducting and performing, again, the effectiveness of an exterior size up around the perimeter, the 360, looking at, again, roof conditions, perimeter walls, the absence or presence of doorways, openings, access points, the degree of percentages, identifying construction features around the perimeter walls, and then again, taking a look at compartment conditions, floor and or ceiling conditions, and identifying the absence or presence of voids, which are part and fundamental of our fireground facts program and modeling. So we're going to have part 3 of our program that we're going to conduct live from FDIC during FDIC week. And I think we're anticipating our presentations to be occurring sometime on April 9th, 10th, and possibly even the 11th. There'll be more information forthcoming on that. Be aware that if you're not, that we're conducting a program at FDIC on Wednesday, April 9th, and it'll be an afternoon classroom, and we're doing insights on the influence of building construction and occupancy risks on fireground decision-making, both for the company and command officers, really open to all ranks and positions. But take a look at the schedule. If you're so inclined, we'd love to have you grab a seat and be part of our classroom presentation. 3:30 on the afternoon of Wednesday, April 9th, the influence of building construction on decision-making is our class. We will also be conducting during FDIC week, bringing again back with our online program, A View from the Streets, reading buildings on the streets of Indy during FDIC week. Some insights on building construction, the features of our buildings, some of the things that we've been doing in Indianapolis for now well over 10 plus years. But the last number of years, we've been fortunate enough to be able to spend quite a bit of time on the streets of Indianapolis looking at a variety of buildings. And again, we'll be posting some of those, and as well as some video clips and some online insights through our posting. So that'll be going on during FDIC week, during that time frame in a couple of weeks. Part 4 of our series will culminate, unless we have another episode that we'll put in place on April 24th. Take a look and listen in on Chief Doug Klein's Fire and Training web and podcast here on Fire Engineering Blog Talk Radio for some insights on some other attributes and discussion points on size up. So that sort of rounds it out between our 2 programs and such. We're hoping to cover a number of different bases. We've got a lot of good things coming up here going into 2024, some exceptional opportunities that are a part of Fire Engineering Magazine, fireengineering.com, as well as some exceptional things that are in the works at FDIC. For those of you that are attending FDIC, please look me up. Please look up Chief Doug Klein. Be aware, keep tabs on what the online programming and scheduling may be for FDIC Live. when we do conduct our pod and webcast live from the floor of FDIC. If you're in the area, you're in town at FDIC, please stop by, look me up, give me a holler, or certainly on the day in which we do our live broadcast, please be part of the audience that normally gathers around the external part of our studio there. We'd love to have you be part of it. But we certainly look forward to seeing many of you out in the streets there at FDIC. And for many of you, we've got a very extensive schedule ahead of us, both in Canada, here in the States. We're traveling all over the U.S. We've got a number of exceptional Reading the Buildings program. We've got some conferences that finally recognize the value of some things that we've been promoting and suggesting in terms of our proposals. So we are going to be taking the classroom into the streets. We're going to conduct our classroom lectures and then take the classroom into the streets and do building reads and do size up. We're going to take our Reading the Buildings tour, our classroom segment, to a number of different cities across the U.S. We've got New York City that's going to be scheduled up and doing our New York City Reading the Building walking tour on a couple of dates coming up. But again, we've got a number of programs throughout the U.S. and we've got a great program scheduled up in Nova Scotia and Halifax coming up here for a program in June. So keep an eye out for all of those. If you're interested in bringing our program to your particular city and locale, please look us up. Again, we do extensive training programs. So again, I would encourage you to take a look at some of the other elements, not to make this any type of a promotional element, but again, it's all about extending that education. You can only get so much out of the pod and webcast, but we do look forward to moving forward with some exceptional opportunities here that we have been very hopeful of for going on over 12 months here. We've been talking about them, but we're really looking forward to materializing those with our good friends here at Fire Engineering and both Fire Engineering Magazine, fireengineering.com, and some things at FDIC, certainly in the next upcoming couple of years. And we really look forward to some great educational insights, some opportunities, some resources that we're going to put in front of you there. And again, to continue to follow the great content here that's provided by Fire Engineering and fireengineering.com in terms of our podcasts, our webcasts, the online information, all of the academies, the great extensive writings and insights, the books that are being published, and many of the other resources that this group and publication and endeavor of all that are all involved continue to provide exceptional training opportunities to continue to move our profession forward, to keep everybody safe. So without further ado, until next time, companies are in quarters and off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind a job is being worked somewhere in the streets in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best, and that's being who we are, and that's firefighters. So stay tuned for some new things coming up here with our Building on Fire series here with Fire Engineering, and stay tuned for some exciting new formatting that we look forward to providing with content here on the new Buildings on Fire podcast here. I'm your host, Chris Naum. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time around.
In firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. For over 20 years, the Fire Store has equipped first responders with trusted gear featuring brands like MSA Carnes for helmets and Seek for thermal imaging cameras. Stay prepared. Visit thefirestore.com today.
Fire Facilities manufacture steel live fire training towers, customized to meet your training needs. Check us out at FDIC or learn more at firefacilities.com.